Hey y'all, I know it's been a little bit since the election, and this video would have come out a little bit sooner, except the entire thing crashed while I was doing my final watch through before posting it, and it miraculously came back today. I can't go through all this work and not post it, you know what I mean? Without further ado, here is the very special edition extended episode of Dig Deep recapping the election results. You could just Google the election results, but then you'd be left wondering, what does it all really mean? So grab some water, sit back, and let's get into it.
I dig down deep, 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 deep.
I'm Justin Pettyboat, and you're watching Dig Deep, the show where we take a complex topic and make it so much easier. This week, we're talking about the most expensive midterm election ever. The 2018 election also saw record-breaking voter turnout on average for a midterm election nationwide. So let's dive into what happened, why it matters, and what it means for you. Let's kick this off with the outcomes of the ballot measures, since that's what we talked about here on my channel, starting with Oregon. Measure 102 did pass, rewriting the Oregon Constitution so we can give public taxpayer bond revenue to private companies to build private affordable housing. Most importantly, that means we'll get some much needed affordable housing very soon. And taxpayers get to vote on each project and decide rules for each of them, so that's good. In the long term, we should watch for the Oregon legislature to pass any meaningful legislation to address income inequality, which is the root of the housing crisis. Or we could watch the Oregon legislature continue passing nothing impactful and then come to us with more measures that give money to already wealthy people and then pretend we had no other option. And then we can elect Jesse to office. No, Jesse in office would be very bad for me and my 17 homes that I do not use. Exactly. This is not the video where we discuss my running. Measure 103 failed, which is great because if anyone should be exempt from paying taxes, it should not be corporations, who will definitely fund the campaign to make sure actual human beings are not exempt from paying taxes. Because they understand that taxes are fundamental for our roads, schools, and businesses to work. They just don't want to be the ones to pay them. I'm just saying, why do our companies need to pay taxes when everybody else can pay them for us? This isn't over. Oh, I fully expect more from you in 2020. 104 also failed, maintaining that the legislature needs a supermajority vote to increase taxes, and only need a simple majority vote to, say, change a tax exemption, which currently gives most benefits to people who are already wealthy. A related outcome of the 2018 election is that the Oregon legislature actually gained enough Democrat seats that they now have a supermajority and can increase taxes. So also keep an eye on the state legislature to do that. Wouldn't it be nice to have an elected official in the state legislature who could release vlogs on their YouTube channel summarizing what's going on so you don't miss things like that? We are not discussing me running for office right now, alternate version of me who's reading off a script that I wrote to start eliciting responses to me running for office. 105 also failed, which is great because it's racist and a huge waste of resources. Even though it failed, Oregonians do have to live with the reality that a lot of people voted racist, which we actually already knew would happen. And Measure 106 failed, continuing a trend in Oregon of protecting women's rights to their own bodies. So what went down in Washington State? Well, it wasn't as nice as what went down in Oregon. In fact, it was awful. And I'm nicknaming it, "We hate taxes and we will literally die on that hill." Initiative 1631 failed, as did a piece of anti-fracking legislation in Colorado, which means the 2018 election passed with no substantial climate change legislation. Washingtonians hate anything that's a tax, even though this was technically a fee. And even one of the most progressive states in the country hasn't yet accepted that we don't get to keep living the same way we have in the face of impending global disaster, the likes of which have never before been seen. 2018 also brought us the new edition of the International Climate Change Report, which saw people forming group therapy sessions in order to deal with just how awful things are gonna be. For those older folks who always said at least it wouldn't happen in your lifetime, you get to watch the world fall apart with the rest of us. At least I'll be fine because I'm rich. You're actually my #1 target, so maybe not. I am working on a new video about what we can and must do, so don't think that all hope is lost. Initiative 1634 passed, which either means that a majority of Washingtonians were actually tricked into thinking we were banning a grocery tax, or the more likely answer, the Washingtonians hate taxes so much they decided the first group that should be exempt from paying them is multinational billions of dollars in profit soda companies. At least we had one big win this election. We'll just keep making billions in profits and then we'll donate like 0.05% of that to heart disease, and then we'll pretend we care about health. Initiative 1639 passed, bringing sweeping gun legislation to Washington state. I knew that this one passed because I am still getting poorly written angry hate comments on my 1639 video from people who live in other states telling me that they will never move to Washington now. And thank goodness. My character was created to parody the idea of crazy dumb gun people, to highlight the fact that real gun advocates just aren't like that. Then it turns out that reasonable gun advocates aren't the type of people who leave angry YouTube comments. People who spoon their guns at night are. I do want to say that if I could rewrite one video, it would be the 1639 video, but I also wish that like the NRA wasn't an evil company and we could have genuine discussions instead of being constantly confused by lies. Sometimes it just be like that. Initiative 940 passed, helping bridge the divide between the police and the communities they serve. Watch the state legislature in 2019 to see which amendments pass and who shows up with good intentions. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. Advisory vote 19 failed, which can also be chalked up to how much Washingtonians hate taxes. Luckily, it's non-binding, which means the state legislature can and should say thank you. Next. We saw states across the country pass some hugely impactful ballot measures of their own, so let's dive into a couple of those that I think you should definitely know about. Florida passed the landmark Amendment 4, which reinstates voting rights for 1.4 million ex-felons, excluding those convicted of murder or sex offenses. That makes up about 9% of the total voting population of Florida and will have huge impacts on future elections in what has historically been a swing state. Why? Because people of color are disproportionately policed and imprisoned, and that process has stripped millions of people of their right to vote. And now voting in Florida will more accurately represent the actual population of Florida. Before this vote, Florida was one of 3 states in the entire country that prevent people from voting even after they've completed their sentence. On the other side, only 2 states in the US currently allow everyone to vote, including people who are in prison right now. So most states are somewhere in the middle. Massachusetts passed a sweeping anti-discrimination measure protecting trans people and everyone else from being discriminated against because of their gender. Unfortunately, that doesn't protect me from being called soy boy or in my YouTube comments. Medicaid expansion passed in Idaho, Nebraska, and Utah. You heard me right, Idaho, Nebraska, and Utah, expanding Medicare for 300,000 more low-income people in those states. Arkansas and Missouri both passed increases in the minimum wage, which is great because everyone's doing really bad at fixing income inequality, but Arkansas is one of the worst. Michigan became the 10th state to legalize marijuana, and Utah and Missouri both passed medical marijuana. A version of Marsy's Law was approved in Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Nevada, North Carolina, and Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the plain. The idea is to give protective rights to victims, but it's actually opposed by the ACLU. And it's a pretty complex law, so I don't want to get into it right now, but if you're really passionate but not passionate enough to read the Wikipedia article yourself, tell me in the comments below and maybe I'll summarize the Wikipedia article for you. But also, don't. And Alabama and West Virginia both outlawed abortions. However, because of Roe v. Wade nationally, they can't actually outlaw abortions. So why did they do it? 2 reasons. 1, they just wanted to remind women that they don't value them, and 2, they see anti-abortion judges being appointed to federal positions, and they want to be ready in case those judges do find a way to overturn Roe v. Wade. Hey Alabamians and West Virginians, if you leave your racism behind, Oregon has some pretty great laws for body autonomy. The main results that stole national headlines. Let's talk about Congress. More women than ever were elected to Congress, claiming more than 200 seats and making the gender makeup of Congress closer to reflecting the actual US. We saw the youngest woman elected, the first Somali American woman, the first 2 Native American women, one of them is a lesbian war veteran, the first 2 Muslim women, multiple states elected their first black woman to Congress, multiple states elected their first Latinx woman to Congress, and multiple states elected their first gay and lesbian people to Congress. In a representative democracy that's supposed to represent the US, this is great. Unless you're a white nationalist, and I know that some of my haters are, so go yourself. The GOP gained more seats in Senate, bolstering their current hold. Meanwhile, we saw the Democrats take the House, putting a much-needed check on the president. Since the GOP has proven themselves entirely incapable of even trying to stop some pretty awful things in the last 2 years. We aren't done yet. Let's talk about the governor races. In Oregon, Kate Brown won her first race for governor after stepping into the role when Kit Hopper stepped down, which now seems like ages ago. In Florida, we saw the Democratic nominee concede and then revoke that concession after it was announced they would do a recount, even though it was unlikely that he would win anyways. And then he did eventually concede to the Republican candidate who had spent some time sucking up to the president and then had to publicly come out against him about Puerto Rico, which is just like usually what happens when you saddle up to the biggest hot mess in the entire world. The next governor race in Florida will definitely be an interesting one now that 1.4 million Floridians have the right to vote again. I don't think racist robocalls from alt-right groups will go over quite as well next time. And now let's talk about Georgia, which really exemplified voter suppression this year. Voter suppression's bad. The Secretary of State there, Kemp, was running for governor, and the Secretary of State oversees the election, but then Kemp was like, nah, I'm not gonna sit this one out. Even after President Jimmy Carter was like, hey, you should sit this one out. It's not illegal because it's not supposed to be possible to rig the election. But then we saw millions of voter registrations purged from the system. 53,000 voter registrations were held up at the Secretary of State's office for having a non-exact match between voter registration and their driver's license, down to like hyphens and spaces in like Del Rio, for example. We saw even less polling locations available in a midterm election when people knew there would be record voter turnout, and voter terminals were just sitting somewhere in storage. Suspiciously, the places with fewer polling places were predominantly black and more likely to vote for the Secretary of State's opponent. And longer lines of polling places have been linked to a decrease in voter turnout and a decrease in faith in our democracy in future elections. We saw folks find out they were purged when they arrived, and then the corrective process messed up, were way too long to go through, and people weren't able to vote. In the end, despite all of that, the votes were so close they had to go into a recount to verify the results. Nobody conceded for weeks, and the non-Secretary of State candidate Abrams was getting closer and closer to Kemp, with more votes being counted. In the end, however, Abrams did concede the election to Kemp. Imagine rigging an entire election system for years, and then still only narrowly winning. But I'm sure he's going to be a great governor. Abrams' supporters have since filed a lawsuit against Georgia's entire election process, asking for specific changes to reinstill people's faith in the system, because we can't have a democracy if nobody believes in the process. The lawsuit asks for the changes to be made by the 2020 election, which is obviously very important. The lawsuit does not try to invalidate Kemp's victory, which is also important because they don't want people doubting democracy in the 2018 election or in future elections. Speaking of runoff elections, Mississippi gave us another hot mess when their Republican Senate candidate, Hyde-Smith, made a lynching joke. Mississippi has a horrid history of lynching, and Hyde-Smith making the joke shows that she has no regard for the historic trauma of the people she's supposed to represent. She then issued a non-apology, basically saying, sorry you got offended, and then I think she probably did issue a real apology, but it's hard to tell because she made another joke, this time about voter suppression, in a state with a history of voter suppression, in an election with a lot of voter suppression, because white nationalists, they don't want representative democracy. And if that all wasn't enough questionably, but probably, racist-toned activities, Hyde-Smith then posted a photo of herself repping some Confederate soldier gear. Now, I'm not saying I agree that we should respect the Confederacy, but I do get that people pretend we can separate the history from the racism. However, if you're running for office and you've already done two majorly tone-deaf things, maybe don't post that on social media, unless you're pandering to your racist base. Oh wait. That would be the end of the video, except North Carolina has called their entire election into question, unverifying every single result. Basically, there's data on mail-in absentee ballots in 2 counties that indicates that something fishy may have happened, and now they're going to conduct an independent investigation to find out if it did. One of the situations from this case that I find hilarious and also really tragic So people came to the voters' doors and they were like, oh, we're here to pick up your ballots. And this woman was like, oh, well, mine's not finished yet. And then the person who came to her door was like, that's fine, I'll finish it for you. And then the woman was like, yeah, sure, and just gave her her ballot. So anyways, in case it needs said, people coming to your door and putting your ballots in unmarked envelopes is not a valid voting process. That about wraps up the whole thing. There was enough voter suppression in this election to have a whole video about that on its own, and I think I'll bring it up in a future video about the state of our democracy. However, if you really want to know the specifics about that, tell me in the comments below and I'll try to tell you. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and next time somebody's like, what happened in the election? Send them this video because so much happened in this election. Subscribe for more content about the important stuff happening, and if you really like it, leave a comment because right now, the only comments I get are hate comments telling me I'm gonna end up in a gas chamber. I'll see you all next time. Bye!